You know, there's a certain peace you find living by a lake, a rhythm that seeps into your bones over the years. My little place, it's not much, just a cozy cabin my granddad built tucked away on a rise overlooking Blackwood Lake. For 30-odd years, I've watched the sun rise and set over that water, seen the seasons painted in 100 different hues. Granddad, he knew this lake like the back of his hand. He'd tell me stories, not just about the fishing, but about the lake's moods, its temper. She breathes, Sammy, he'd say, his voice raspy like dry leaves. In the winter, she pulls in, gathers herself. Come summer, with the rains, she stretches out, takes what's hers. He had journals, filled with spidery handwriting, sketches of water lines during the big wet year of '58. Or, that surprise flood in '73. I still have them, tucked away safe. They're more accurate than any modern survey, if you ask me, because they speak of patterns, not just snapshots. Life was good, predictable in the best way. The loons would call in the spring, the bass would bite in the summer, and the autumn leaves would drift across the still water like tiny, golden boats. Then came the letter. Official-looking, crisp envelope, a stark contrast to the usual junk mail and fishing catalogs. It was from the county, a notice of proposed development. Whispering Pines Lakeview Estates, it proclaimed. 49 new homes. Right across the water from me on the low-lying meadow that had always been, well, a meadow. Sometimes a soggy meadow, depending on the year. My first thought was, they can't be serious, that land? My granddad's journals had a special name for it, the soaker, because that's what it did. It soaked. I walked out to my porch, coffee cup in hand, and looked across the shimmering expanse. The lake was in its winter phase, drawn back, modest. The meadow looked dry, inviting even. But I could already see the ghosts of summer waterlines in my mind's eye, Granddad's sketches superimposed over the landscape. This wasn't just NIMBYism, not just me wanting to keep my view pristine, though I won't lie, that was part of it. This was about a fundamental misunderstanding, a catastrophic underestimation of the place they were about to disturb. The first surveyors arrived a few weeks later, bright vests and tripods. I ambled over one afternoon, introduced myself. Nice enough young fella, probably fresh out of college. I tried to be casual. You folks know this area floods up pretty good in the summer, right? This whole flat section here can get mighty wet. He just smiled, a polite, dismissive little smile. Oh, we've got all the topographical data, sir. Our engineers have run all the models. It's well within tolerances. Such a clinical word for what I knew could be a good 3 feet of water depending on the year's rainfall. I mentioned my granddad's records, the local history. He nodded like I was telling him quaint folk tales. Appreciate the local color, sir, but we rely on precision instruments. I walked away feeling that familiar frustration you get when you're talking to someone who's got all the book learning but none of the dirt under the fingernails knowing. The chainsaws started a month later, a mournful whine that echoed across the lake, ripping through the morning quiet I cherished. They were clearing the land, taking down the willows and alders that didn't mind wet feet. Each fallen tree felt like a small death, a precursor to a much bigger, more expensive mistake. The pit in my stomach wasn't just for the trees, it was for the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it all. They were building on borrowed time, on land borrowed from a lake that always, eventually, collected its dues. The entity behind Whispering Pines Lakeview Estates soon materialized in the form of a homeowners association, or rather, the developer who would eventually hand it off to one. They held an informational meeting at the town hall, complete with glossy brochures showing happy families waving from the decks of beautiful, modern homes, the lake sparkling conveniently just beyond their perfectly manicured lawns. Lawns that, in my mind, were already underwater. The star of the show was a Mr. Alistair Abernathy, president of the development company. He was a vision in a tailored suit, silver hair swept back, a voice as smooth and reassuring as a late-night radio host. He spoke of harmonizing with nature, of sustainable design, and creating a vibrant new lakeside community. I waited my turn, clutching a dog-eared copy of one of Granddad's journal pages, the one with the meticulous sketch of the 1958 flood line reaching almost to the old Henderson fence post, a landmark still visible if you knew where to look. When the Q&A started, I stood up. Mr. Abernathy, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. My family's lived on this lake for 3 generations. That land you're planning to build on, it's a natural floodplain. My grandfather documented water levels covering that entire meadow by several feet during wet summers. I have his records here. I held up the page. Abernathy gave me that patient, slightly patronizing smile that people in power reserve for those they consider a minor nuisance. Thank you for your input, Mr. Jackson, I supplied. Sam Jackson, Mr. Jackson. We appreciate your historical perspective. However, our team of expert hydrologists and engineers has conducted exhaustive studies. We have state-of-the-art LiDAR surveys, percolation tests, 20-year floodplain data. I can assure you and all prospective residents that every home in Whispering Pines will be built to the highest standards of safety and well above any projected high water mark based on all current and historical official data. He emphasized official data. As if my granddad's meticulously kept, decades-spanning, first-hand observations were just campfire stories. Someone from his team, a younger man with a clipboard and an equally smug expression, chimed in, "Sir, with all due respect, anecdotal evidence from 70 years ago, while charming, doesn't supersede modern engineering science charming. That's what they call decades of lived experience." I tried again. But the official data often relies on shorter timeframes. This lake has cycles that go beyond 20 or even 50 years. There are specific topographical features of this basin, the narrow outlet downstream. Abernathy cut me off, his smile tightening just a fraction. "Mr. Jackson, we have invested millions in due diligence. We are confident in our findings. Now, if there are any other questions related to the amenities or the purchase process." I sat down fuming. The crowd, mostly potential buyers lured by the promise of affordable lakeside living, seemed placated by Abernathy's confident dismissal. I was just the local crank, the old man afraid of change. After the meeting, I tried to approach Abernathy directly, show him the journal. He waved me off to his clipboard-wielding assistant, who took my offered page with the same enthusiasm he might a piece of litter, promising to file it appropriately. I knew then I wasn't going to stop them with words. So I started documenting. I took photos of the meadow before construction. I wrote down the dates and times of my warnings, who I spoke to, their exact responses. I even sent a registered letter to Whispering Pines Lakeview Estates LLC outlining my concerns in detail, referencing specific historical water levels and attaching photocopies from Granddad's journals. I got a form letter back thanking me for my interest. The dry season was well underway, the lake receding to its lowest point. The construction crews swarmed the meadow. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. They were building their doomed city at the exact time the lake offered its most deceptive, benign appearance. Their overconfidence was as vast and unshakable as the concrete foundations they were pouring. The sound of construction became the new soundtrack to my lakeside life. The whine of saws, the thud of hammers, the beep-beep-beep of reversing trucks, a constant, grating reminder of the folly unfolding across the water. 49 homes. It was an ambitious project, and they attacked it with a relentless, almost furious energy. Frames went up with astonishing speed, transforming the once-green meadow into a skeleton city of raw lumber. I watched from my porch, a pair of binoculars, my new constant companion. Each nail driven felt like another step towards an inevitable, watery reckoning. My attempts to reason with the powers that be had hit a wall of corporate platitudes and bureaucratic indifference. I'd sent copies of my concerns, along with excerpts from Granddad's journals, to the county planning department and even the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. The responses were dishearteningly similar. The project was approved based on a thorough review of engineering reports submitted by the developer. Or, we have no jurisdiction unless current regulations are being violated. No one wanted to look beyond the officially sanctioned paperwork, the neatly packaged lies that confirmed the land was safe. It was a closed loop of liability dodging. I wasn't entirely alone in my skepticism. I'd talked to some of the other old-timers in the area, folks like Jebediah Thorne, who ran the marina down at the south end. Jeb was older than dirt and twice as ornery, and he'd seen more lake cycles than anyone. "Sam," he cackled, his eyes twinkling, "those fancy city folk are gonna get their Gucci loafers wet, mark my words. That meadow's always been the lake's bathtub when she decides to stretch." He even had a couple of faded photographs from the big flood of '58, showing rowboats practically up to the windows of the old Miller cabin, which stood on land slightly higher than where Whispering Pines was now taking root. The photos were grainy, black and white, but the message was stark. I asked Jeb for copies, and he was happy to oblige. More fuel for my documentation, more evidence for the "I told you so" file that was growing thicker by the week. The HOA, or rather Abernathy's company, was already in full sales mode. Shiny banners appeared, "Waterfront living starts here." Phase 1 nearly sold out. I imagined the sales pitches, the serene views, the private docks they probably promised, the gentle lapping of waves. They weren't selling homes, they were selling a fantasy, one that the lake itself would soon shatter. I made a point of keeping my documentation meticulous. Every letter sent, every response received or not received, every photograph was dated and cataloged. I even started a daily log of the lake level using a simple marker I hammered into the shoreline below my property, far from their development but indicative of the overall water body. It felt a bit like being a scientist observing a slow-motion train wreck, powerless to stop it but compelled to record every detail of its disastrous trajectory. The sheer audacity of it all was what got to me most. They weren't just building a few cabins, they were erecting a small town, paving roads, laying infrastructure, all on land that periodically belonged to the lake. It was a gamble against nature, and nature, as Granddad always said, rarely loses. As the last of the autumn leaves fell and the air grew crisp, the construction on the first dozen or so homes neared completion. Roofs were shingled, windows installed, siding painted in tasteful, earthy tones. They looked like houses. Expensive houses. Houses that were deeply, profoundly in the wrong place. The late autumn chill eventually gave way to the damp, brooding quiet that precedes our winter rains. Here in the foothills, winter doesn't always mean snow. More often, it means weeks of steady, soaking rain that replenishes the aquifers and, crucially, begins the slow, inexorable swelling of Blackwood Lake. I found myself watching the sky more than usual, noting the direction of the wind, the feel of the air. Granddad used to say you could smell the big rains coming, a certain earthy, metallic tang in the breeze. I started smelling it in early December. The first phase of Whispering Pines homes looked eerily complete. Fresh sod, still bright green, was rolled out like carpets over land that would soon be mire. Asphalt driveways gleamed blackly. Decorative lampposts stood sentinel, ready to illuminate. What? The rising damp? I saw a few sold signs go up, and occasionally a car I didn't recognize would pull up to one of the new houses, prospective buyers perhaps, or the first brave souls moving in. I wondered if they'd asked about the water. I wondered what lies they'd been told. I made one last, almost perfunctory attempt at a warning. I saw a landscaping crew working near the water's edge on their side, struggling to get some ornamental shrubs into the already soft ground. I took my little rowboat across. The foreman, a burly guy named Henderson, looked surprised to see me. "Morning," I said. "Just thought I'd mention you might want to plant those a bit higher up. This whole area tends to get pretty saturated when the winter rains really set in, and come spring and summer, well, the lake itself comes visiting." He wiped sweat from his brow even though it was cool. "Yeah, the ground's a bit soggier than they told us. But Mr. Abernathy's people said their drainage is state of the art. Supposed to handle anything." He shrugged, a gesture of a man just doing his job, not paid to think too hard about it. "Good luck with that," I said, and rowed back, the sound of my oars a quiet counterpoint to the distant hum of their ongoing work. My documentation continued. I set up an old trail cam I had, pointing it towards the new development from my side of the lake, programmed to take a photo every few hours. I also had my marked stake at my shoreline, photographing it daily with a date stamp. I consulted Granddad's journals again, comparing his notes on rainfall patterns and lake responses from similar years. He'd meticulously recorded not just the peak levels, but the rate of rise, the duration of inundation. It was all there, a 70-year-old prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. The narrative Abernathy was selling was one of control, of human ingenuity taming nature. The reality, as I knew it, was that Blackwood Lake was a wild thing, patient but persistent. It tolerated human presence on its terms, and those terms included reclaiming its floodplain when the time was right. The suspense was almost palpable now, at least for me. Across the water, they were putting up Christmas decorations on some of the finished houses, little twinkling lights reflecting on the currently placid surface of the lake. It was a picture of serene domesticity, utterly oblivious to the hydrological drama slowly unfolding beneath their feet. I felt like the only person in the audience who'd read the script and knew the tragic, or perhaps darkly comic, final act was about to begin. The air grew heavier, the clouds lower, and the lake seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The first proper rains arrived just after the new year, not the dramatic thunderstorms of summer, but a persistent, soaking drizzle that went on for days, then weeks. It was the kind of rain that seeps deep into the earth, filling every crack and crevice, swelling the streams and creeks that fed Blackwood Lake. I watched my marked stake with a grim sort of fascination. Inch by inch, the water crept upwards. Nothing alarming at first, just the lake slowly waking from its winter slumber, stretching. Across the water, at Whispering Pines, the first signs of trouble were subtle. The perfect green sod, so recently laid, turned into a squelchy, muddy mess. The construction crews, still working on later phases, found their heavy equipment bogging down. I saw them laying down gravel and wooden planks to create makeshift roads on what were supposed to be paved streets. I'd take my binoculars and scan the development. Those sold homes, some now presumably occupied, started to look less idyllic. Water pooled persistently in the yards, refusing to drain despite Mr. Abernathy's state-of-the-art drainage. I could almost hear the grumbling from my porch, the confused phone calls to the HOA management office, which was probably still Abernathy's company. Yes, Mrs. Henderson, we understand your azaleas are waterlogged. We're looking into some localized drainage issues. Localized, right? The entire development was a localized drainage issue. My trail cam diligently clicked away, capturing the slow transformation. The pristine shoreline on their side, once a neat, defined edge, began to blur as the lake's waters started to kiss the bottom of their carefully landscaped rockeries. The decorative grasses planted for that natural lakeside look were now submerged at their bases, looking bewildered. I'd occasionally see Abernathy's shiny black SUV making its way slowly through the development. He'd get out, point, talk animatedly with Foreman. He still had that air of supreme confidence, but I thought I detected a slight furrow in his brow, a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. Or maybe I was just projecting. One Saturday, a new resident, a young fella I'd seen unloading a U-Haul a few weeks prior, was standing at the edge of his lawn, which was now more of a shallow pond, staring disconsolately at the encroaching water. He had that bewildered look of someone whose dream home was turning into a swamp. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He was a victim of Abernathy's hubris, but also of his own lack of due diligence. Hadn't anyone thought to ask the locals, the people who'd lived here for years? Or were they so dazzled by the glossy brochures and the promise of a bargain that they skipped that common-sense step? The official line from Whispering Pines when snippets of complaints started appearing on local social media pages was that this was an unusually wet winter and that their systems were performing as designed but under unexpected stress. Unexpected if you hadn't bothered to look at anything beyond a 10-year weather chart, perhaps? Granddad's journals, by contrast, would have called it a decent soaking, nothing special yet. The irony was starting to bloom like algae in a stagnant pond. The Lakeview estates were indeed getting a view of the lake, an increasingly intimate one. The water wasn't just a picturesque backdrop anymore, it was an active participant, an unwelcome guest slowly inviting itself into their living rooms. And this was just the beginning. The real show, the summer expansion driven by heavier rains and snowmelt from the distant hills, was yet to come. This was merely the overture. The rains, which had been steady, intensified through February and into March. The kind of downpours that turned driveways into rivers and overwhelmed gutters. Blackwood Lake, already swollen, began its serious ascent. My marked stake was now measuring the rise not in inches per week, but inches per day. The lower-lying sections of Whispering Pines, those unfortunate lots closest to what used to be the winter waterline, were no longer just soggy, they were actively flooding. Lawns vanished completely. Then the brand-new asphalt driveways began to disappear under a shimmering sheet of brown water. Next, it was the turn of the crawl spaces. I started hearing rumors filtering through Jeb at the marina, who had a nephew working on a desperate ad hoc drainage crew Abernathy had hired. They got pumps going 24/7 under some of them houses, Sam, Jeb reported, a grim chuckle in his voice. Trying to pump the lake back into the lake, if you ask me. Stupidest thing I ever saw. Panic, it seemed, was beginning to set in. I saw trucks delivering sandbags, a comically inadequate gesture against a body of water the size of Blackwood. A few hardy souls in rubber boots were trying to create flimsy barriers around their new homes, their faces etched with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Abernathy's black SUV was a more frequent sight, zipping between troubled spots, its driver looking increasingly harried. He even made a statement to the local paper, which had started sniffing around after complaints from residents became more vocal. He blamed unprecedented rainfall patterns likely due to climate change and assured everyone that remedial actions were underway and that all homes were structurally sound and built above the designated 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain. That was their magic bullet, their shield against liability. But as Granddad always said, nature doesn't read government maps, and this wasn't even a 100-year event. This was just the lake being the lake, a fact conveniently ignored in their glossy prospectuses. From my vantage point, safely elevated, I had a panoramic view of the slow-motion disaster. The meticulously planned symmetry of Whispering Pines was dissolving into a chaotic, watery mess. The private boat slips some brochures had hinted at were now a moot point. You could practically launch a kayak from your front porch if your porch wasn't already submerged. I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. There was a grim satisfaction, the vindication of knowing my warnings and Granddad's wisdom had been correct. There was also a sense of profound sadness for the land itself, scarred by this ill-conceived venture. And yes, a sliver of pity for the poor souls who'd bought into Abernathy's dream, though that pity was heavily diluted by the memory of their and his earlier dismissiveness. My documentation became even more focused. The trail cam captured the relentless creep of the water. My daily photos of the stake showed the lake claiming more and more territory. I made sure my own property was secure, not that it was ever in danger from these normal fluctuations, but it felt like a symbolic act of stewardship. The contrast was stark, my old, weathered cabin, standing firm and dry, versus those gleaming new houses, barely a year old, already succumbing to the very element they were supposed to offer a view of. The true test, I knew, was still approaching. The spring melt from the mountains, combined with the heavy spring rains, traditionally brought the lake to its summer peak. What we were seeing now was just the warm-up act. The main event was yet to come, and Mr. Abernathy's state-of-the-art drainage and 100-year floodplain calculations were about to face their ultimate, and I suspected, failing grade. The spring equinox passed, and with it came the deluge. Not the gentle soaking of winter, but torrential downpours, the kind that announce the full arrival of the growing season and send cascades of water rushing down the mountainsides that form Blackwood Lake's vast watershed. The snowpack in the higher elevations, already substantial from a colder-than-average late winter, began to melt in earnest, feeding a torrent into the streams and rivers that, in turn, disgorged their contents into the lake. Blackwood Lake transformed. It was no longer just creeping. It was surging. My marked stake, the one I'd been photographing daily, was now completely submerged. I had to scramble to install a new, higher one. Across the water, the scene at Whispering Pines had shifted from troubled to catastrophic. The first few homes, those built on the absolute lowest elevations of the ill-fated meadow, were now undeniably, irrevocably flooded. Water wasn't just lapping at foundations, it was halfway up the first-floor windows of some. The beautifully paved roads were submerged canals. The decorative lamp posts looked like forlorn channel markers in a newly formed, very expensive swamp. Access to a significant portion of the development was cut off unless you had a boat. Even Abernathy's sandbagging efforts, which had escalated to small levees of hastily piled dirt and plastic sheeting, were overwhelmed, breached, and rendered utterly pathetic against the lake's determined advance. The local news, which had been doing small, human interest pieces about soggy lawns, now descended in force. News vans with satellite dishes sprouted like mushrooms. Reporters in rain slickers stood in front of flooded houses, microphones in hand, talking about the plight of homeowners and questions raised about development practices. It was a full-blown media circus. Occasionally, a reporter would make their way over to my side of the lake. Having heard about the old-timer who predicted this, I kept my responses calm, factual. Yes, I'd say the lake does this. It's been documented for generations. This isn't a surprise to anyone who knows Blackwood Lake. It's a natural cycle. I'd show them copies of Granddad's journal pages, the photos Jeb had given me. I wasn't looking for glory, I was just stating the facts that had been so arrogantly dismissed. The focus, rightly, was on the visual devastation. Brand new homes, paint barely dry, standing in 3 feet of murky water. Belongings floating out of breached garages. The carefully cultivated curb appeal, now a scene of utter desolation. The Whispering Pines HOA, or what was left of Abernathy's development company still managing it, was in full-blown crisis. Abernathy himself became a ghost, no longer seen prowling the site. His pronouncements, when they came, were through press releases, still blaming unforeseeable act of God weather events and vowing to support our residents. Support them how? With inflatable rafts? The blame game began in earnest within their ranks, I heard. Engineers blaming surveyors for bad initial data. Surveyors blaming outdated county flood maps. Everyone blaming the unprecedented weather, conveniently forgetting that unprecedented often just means we didn't look back far enough. The sheer, unmitigated incompetence was breathtaking. The cost of their hubris wasn't just financial, it was in the shattered dreams of those who'd bought homes, in the environmental damage from inundated building materials and failing septic systems. Yes, some of those lakeside lots had septic. Another stroke of genius. My "I told you so" moment had arrived, not with a bang, but with the relentless, silent rise of water. It was a somber kind of vindication. Nature had spoken, and its voice was the quiet, insistent lapping of water against walls where it never should have been. The summer peak arrived, and Blackwood Lake, in all its swollen glory, held Whispering Pines in a watery embrace. At least a dozen homes were severely flooded, their interiors ruined. Many more suffered extensive water damage to foundations, crawl spaces, and landscaping. The development looked like a failed aquatic experiment. Then, as the rains subsided and the summer sun beat down, the lake began its slow, equally inexorable retreat, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The aftermath was, in many ways, worse than the flood itself. As the waters receded, they revealed a landscape coated in a thick, stinking layer of silt and debris. The once brightly colored homes were stained with muddy waterlines like bathtub rings on a colossal scale. Lawns were gone, replaced by expanses of cracked mud and opportunistic weeds. The air hung heavy with the smell of mildew, rot, and despair. The legal battles erupted almost immediately. Furious homeowners, many of them displaced and facing financial ruin, banded together. Class action lawsuits were filed against Abernathy's development company, against the county for approving the permits, against the engineering firms that had signed off on the flawed plans. It was a lawyer's paradise and a homeowner's nightmare. My meticulous documentation, those photographs, the copies of Granddad's journals, the registered letters suddenly became very valuable. I was contacted by a law firm representing a group of the Whispering Pines homeowners. I met with a young, earnest lawyer named Sarachin who listened intently as I laid out the timeline of my warnings and the developer's dismissals. I handed over copies of everything. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her eyes wide after reviewing the material, this is incredible. You essentially handed them the blueprint for this disaster, and they ignored it." I just shrugged. "They had their experts. I was just the local yokel with his granddad's fairy tales." Abernathy's company predictably declared bankruptcy protection, a common maneuver to shield assets and escape the worst of the financial fallout. Abernathy himself vanished from public view, his reputation, much like his development, in tatters. The county officials who had rubber-stamped the project were suddenly very busy pointing fingers elsewhere or claiming they were bound by the expert reports they'd received. The blame, like the floodwaters, spread far and wide, soaking everyone it touched. Some of the supporting characters in this drama emerged with more credit. One was an elderly woman, Mrs. Albright, one of the first to buy a home in Whispering Pines. She had sunk her life savings into what she thought was her dream retirement cottage. Now she was leading the charge for the homeowners group, a tiny, fierce woman fueled by righteous indignation. She'd call me sometimes asking for clarification on some historical detail from Granddad's journals, her voice trembling with anger but also with determination. "We won't let them get away with this, Mr. Jackson," she'd declare. The ruined homes stood as monuments to greed and incompetence. Some were eventually condemned. Others sat in a legal limbo, too damaged to live in, too costly to repair, especially with the knowledge that the lake would be back next year and the year after that. The environmental cost was also significant. Flooded septic systems leached contaminants into the soil and the lake. Building materials, insulation, plastics, all manner of detritus had been submerged and then exposed, a toxic mess. The vindication I felt was a heavy thing, tinged with the sadness of such needless destruction. The beautiful meadow was gone, replaced by the scar on the landscape. But the lake, well, the lake was just being itself. As autumn painted the hillsides in hues of gold and crimson, Blackwood Lake settled back into its more modest winter dimensions. It left Whispering Pines looking like a war zone. Mud-caked, mold-infested husks of houses stood abandoned, their windows like vacant ice staring out at the water that had been their undoing. The sounds of construction were long gone, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the wind whistling through broken panes of glass and the occasional squawk of a scavenger bird. Nature, in its patient way, began the slow work of reclamation. Weeds, then shrubs, started to push through cracked driveways and silt-covered foundations. Small animals, initially displaced by the construction and then the flood, cautiously returned. The newly expanded wetland areas where lawns and patios once stood became havens for waterfowl and amphibians. It was a strange kind of beauty, this wild resurgence in the heart of such human failure. I often sat on my porch watching it, reflecting. The arrogance of it all still astounded me. The belief that a few glossy reports and some confident pronouncements could somehow negate generations of lived experience, could somehow command a natural force like Blackwood Lake to behave. Granddad's journals weren't just anecdotes. They were data, qualitative data perhaps, but rich with the patterns of decades. They spoke of a dynamic system, not the static, predictable entity the developers had assumed. There were endless discussions in the county about what to do with the Whispering Pines debacle. Some wanted to demolish everything and try to restore the meadow, a hugely expensive undertaking. Others argued for some kind of buyout for the afflicted homeowners, though funds were scarce and legal battles ongoing. For now, it mostly just sat there, a decaying testament to folly. Mr. Abernathy was, as far as anyone knew, fighting off lawsuits and creditors from some undisclosed location. His dream of a vibrant lakeside community had quite literally drowned. Sometimes I'd see one or two of the former residents, perhaps retrieving some forgotten item from their ruined homes, their faces etched with a permanent sadness. Mrs. Albright, bless her tenacious heart, was still fighting, though the legal process was grindingly slow. She told me once, "You know, Mr. Jackson, the worst part isn't just the money. It's the feeling of being so utterly betrayed, so completely duped. The primary lesson, I suppose, was one of humility. Humility before the power of the natural world, humility enough to listen to those who have lived alongside it, who understand its rhythms not through computer models alone but through seasons of observation." Poetic justice had been served not by any action of mine beyond trying to sound an alarm, but by the lake itself. It had simply followed its ancient script, a script the developers had arrogantly chosen to ignore, rewriting it with their own disastrous ending. My part in it had been that of a reluctant Cassandra, speaking truth to power that refused to hear, then watching the inevitable unfold. There was no joy in being right in such a destructive way, but there was a quiet affirmation of the things Granddad had taught me: respect the land, understand its ways, and never assume you're smarter than something that's been shaping the earth for millennia. The lake itself seemed to sigh with relief as the machines fell silent and the land began to heal, however slowly. Years have a way of smoothing over even the ugliest scars, though the memory of Whispering Pines Lakeview Estates still lingers around Blackwood Lake like a damp chill on a summer morning. Most of the ruined structures were eventually torn down, a protracted and costly process funded by a combination of county emergency funds and whatever could be clawed back from the bankrupt development company and its insurers. The land itself, that once coveted meadow Granddad called the Soaker, is now mostly managed as a natural wetland and flood overflow area, a designation it should have had all along. Nature has been remarkably quick to reclaim it. Native grasses, willows, and alders are thriving. The birdlife is richer than ever. In a way, the lake has expanded its domain, taking back what was always rightfully its seasonal territory. My life on the lake returned to its familiar rhythm, though I confess I'm a bit more of a local celebrity, or perhaps curiosity, than I ever intended to be. People still stop me sometimes, visitors mostly, asking if I'm that Mr. Jackson, the one who knew about the flood. I just nod and say, the lake knew. I just listened. Granddad's journals are even more precious to me now, not just as family history, but as a testament to the value of deep, patient observation. I sometimes lend copies of relevant pages to the local historical society or to students studying environmental science at the community college. Maybe some future developer, eyeing a tempting piece of underutilized land somewhere, will stumble upon them and pause, just for a moment, to consider the wisdom of those who came before. Mr. Abernathy, I heard, eventually resurfaced in another state, trying to launch some other ambitious project, though I imagine his name carries a certain notoriety in development circles now. The Whispering Pines disaster became a sort of cautionary tale, a case study in what not to do. As for the homeowners, their story is a mixed bag. Some received partial settlements, enough to move on, though scarred by the experience. Others fought for years, mired in legal complexities. Mrs. Albright, bless her, fought until her health gave out, a true warrior for a lost cause who nonetheless managed to bring some accountability where there would have been none. The lake continues its cycles. Every winter it draws in, every summer it expands, though now, when it reaches for that far meadow, it finds not misbegotten houses but a welcoming expanse of reeds and wetlands, doing exactly what a floodplain is supposed to do. There's a different kind of peace on this side of the lake now, a quieter satisfaction. The triumph wasn't a personal victory over an antagonist in a courtroom showdown, it was the quiet, inevitable victory of truth and nature over arrogance and greed. My role was simply to be a witness, a record keeper, and a voice that, though initially ignored, was ultimately validated by the unyielding reality of the water. If there's a lesson in all of this for anyone listening, it's this: before you build your dream, make sure you're not building it on someone else's, especially if that someone else is a lake with a long memory and a habit of stretching out in the summer. Pay attention to the quiet wisdom of the land and the people who have lived with it. Sometimes the most valuable expert reports aren't bound in glossy covers but written in spidery handwriting in a dusty old journal filled with the simple truth of seasons faithfully observed. And always, always respect the water. It was here long before us and it will be here long after we're gone. It always gets the last word.